Samizdat were really important in the Soviet Union in the post-Stalin era as a means of acquiring information that the state did not want them to have. As a citizen of a Western state, I think we take for granted just how plentiful, truthful information about the world is.
Samizdat means underground publishing. It was the means by which the Russian people actually were able to discover the Gulag Archipelago. Courageous people did that.
You still have countries today where Samizdat plays an important role. There are examples in the People's Republic of China, in Cuba. I assume there are examples in North Korea. And so there's still the human spirit, and people want to resist.
In the United States, we are seeing increasingly sophisticated efforts to control the narrative through censorship.
And so what we need to do is double down on education about that. We are still a liberal democracy based on our Constitution, and we should fight for truth and freedom.
If you praise something, you'll get more of it. I think what we need to do is highlight courage. This prize, the people that we're highlighting, is to give a real clear representation of what we're trying to do and say, we cannot be afraid.
Stanford University professor of medicine and co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration, Dr. J. Bhattacharya.
The idea was to devise a new strategy for the COVID-19 epidemic. And our strategy is one of focused protection.
Vastly oversold masking as a solution to this epidemic.
Matt Taibbi is the Racket News editor-in-chief and Griftopia
You make some really tough points. I know you're not a partisan guy.
We saw a stream of communication between the FBI and the largest tech companies in the country.
Miranda Devine, Fox News contributor and New York Post columnist.
They abused their authority. They abused the trust.
There's been some last-minute shenanigans in this case.
What's going on and who's orchestrating all of this?
When I look at people who had the courage to examine the truth and then to speak it at times when they would be vilified for doing so, that's real, genuine courage.
I think the three people that we've chosen, they weathered the storm. And also, they were right. They were vindicated by facts. And that's why we let people talk that we disagree with, because they can teach us something.
When I think about J. Bhattacharya, the word that comes to mind for me is courage. It's easy for someone who doesn't have a lot to lose to put themselves out there on behalf of free speech. But for someone who has everything to lose, is a remarkable act of courage. Matt Taibbi, he has such a unique voice and has had for a long time. And whether you agree with him or disagree with him, I think his voice has grown more critical as we've moved into this battle over free speech. And Miranda Devine has been one of those heroes who's been willing to stand up and just continue to speak and write the truth that a lot of people were prevented from even knowing about. And we need more people like the three people that are being honored.
These are things we should have been talking about in this country. And the people who risk their careers to talk about it, they should build a statue for them.
For a free society to be free, it needs to actually have open discourse. And I think, if we listened to them earlier, we would have all been better.
Congratulations to the worthy recipients of the Samizdat Award. This is a great first class. They are people who are motivated, even at personal cost, to search for the truth.
Well, I guess that's my cue, guys. First off, I want to say how refreshing it is to be at an awards show where people are getting booed for being vaxxed. That is... I am unvaxxed, ladies and gentlemen, unvaxxed. And all of the people who work for me sitting right over there at table 7, unvaxxed. So if you want some of our blood, although it will be filled with tequila, you can meet us after. Speaking of tequila, I did not know, well, congratulations, guys, of course. I did not know that there was a $25,000 prize involved in this. I'm doing it literally for a bottle of tequila. They gave me a bottle of tequila back there. Pretty sweet, pretty sweet. Happy to help. No, but it really, it's an honor to be here with you guys and to play whatever role I play in this fight, helping elevate some of the voices that are really doing the work. I would start by saying that there's quite a juxtaposition of sitting in a room with these fine people and all of you guys compared to what most of America is watching right at this very moment, where a man with dementia is reading poorly off a teleprompter and everyone's just praying he gets to the end of it. I mean, that's kind of where we're at the moment. And I think that is kind of, I call him the sort of avatar for what America feels like right now. We don't know what we are. We don't know what we stand for. We don't know where we came from or where we're going. Except I think you guys do, actually. So, Miranda, why don't I start with you? Because you did so much work with his son and the corruption there and everything else. Where does this leave us with this administration? How should we feel for those of us that are clear-minded and maybe not as partisan as everybody else? How should we feel about what's happening right now with this administration?
Well, I mean, what we'll see, I think, tonight in the State of the Union is just an exercise in fakery. It's all a mirage. It's all a delusion. It's the pretense that Joe Biden is not those things that you said he was. It's the pretense that he's honest Joe, middle-class Joe from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He's a unifier. All the things that, 80 million Americans supposedly were lulled into believing before the 2020 election, none of that was true. And at the Post, we had a little fraction of the truth, which was that, in fact, he was involved in this corrupt influence peddling operation with his family. We had a glimpse of that through Hunter Biden's laptop, and we published it. And I think if the story had not been censored by social media, by big tech, by the FBI pre-bunking our story, by these CIA 51 intelligence officials we now know, including serving CIA officers, had not lied about the story and said it was Russian disinformation, I think the outcome of the election might have been quite different.
So the election, yeah. Jay, let me jump to you there, because when we think of that corruption, you come from academia. You were at the beginning of COVID when I was trying to just get anybody to talk about this with a clear mind. Your name kept popping up, and I said, if I can pronounce his last name, I'll have him on the show. That's how we're going to do it. Bhattacharya. I've been able to do it. But you were clear-minded on COVID really from the beginning. I went back and I watched our first episode. You've been on my show many times now, and you were not as alarmist as everyone. You were not as kind of crazy as everyone. And I wonder, how did that feel for you at the beginning? Now you've sort of, time has vindicated you, but how did it feel at the beginning?
I mean, I thought the world had gone crazy. I mean, I understood why a lot of people were scared, right? There's a new disease floating around. But I'm an epidemiologist. I do health policy. I saw many of the things that Carl said. I saw that because I'd studied them before. I mean, it was just a very strange place that I happened to be at the right place at the right time. So I did what I had always done, which is I wrote scientific papers. What stunned me was the reaction to those papers by my colleagues, by my university. You mentioned the word corruption. It was a corruption of the basic scientific process, attacking somebody who's like saying, here's what the data show. And I have to say one thing, I feel really a little bit uncomfortable on the stage because there's so many people in the audience that might have been here. Like there's essentially the people that spoke up during the pandemic, so many of you are here, and some of the journalists I admire are here. It snowballed, right? As it felt very, very, very alone at the beginning, but very quickly people started to join. People started to speak up at great personal cost. And I've wondered the whole time, why did it require any great personal cost at all? Right? It's a scientific question. It's a policy question. We have processes. we need a society where that kind of discussion doesn't require courage. It should just be a normal part of how we discuss things. That's why the free speech to me is such an important principle. Like, we need to have that so that people can speak up when things go deeply wrong. The idea that somehow has gotten abroad that if you have an emergency, that's when free speech is the most dangerous, right? You need to have some guru that tells you here's what to do. But the exact opposite is true. It's exactly when there is an emergency that free speech is the most needed. When people don't know what's going on, we have to learn from each other, and you only do that if there's free speech.
Well, you're giving me the perfect segue to Matt, obviously, because when Elon came to you and the Twitter files, and we find out that quite literally the government was coordinating with big tech to silence people. I was in the Capitol just a couple of weeks ago, and Jim Jordan showed me the docs. I mean, my name was on the list of people that the government was coordinating with Twitter in terms of suppressing tweets and all of that stuff. And I said to him, I said, well, what can I do? Do they pay you out? Is there a lawsuit? You know, nobody. He said, no, you don't get a letter, you don't get an apology, the janitor won't high five you, there's nothing. There's nothing that they can just infringe on your free speech and you really have no recourse. So you were part, obviously, of all of that. What was your main takeaway? Is your main takeaway that it's really big tech's problem at this point? Is it the government's problem? Is it a 50-50 problem? Where are we at?
That's a really good question. So I think to start at the beginning with Elon, obviously that was a lot like the journalistic version of Charlie Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the golden ticket to look through the secret files of one of the world's biggest corporations. And the first thing that we were looking for was actually had to do with Miranda's story. And I thought, because of a couple of interviews involving Mark Zuckerberg, that we maybe would find a few emails from the FBI about that one story, because we knew that had been suppressed. And ironically, we didn't find a whole lot about your story, Miranda, but we did find within days just a whole galaxy of emails that said things like flagged by FBI, flagged by DHS, flagged by HHS, flagged by Treasury, and it went on and on and on. And we realized immediately that there was this huge sort of operation that spanned the entire federal government to pressure not just Twitter, but 24 at least internet companies to suppress different kinds of information. There's a journalist in the audience here today who writes for RealClear, Aaron Mate, who... There was an incredible communication in there where the FBI passed it along. They basically passed a request on from the Ukrainian Secret Service. FBI is like, hey, can you take this guy off Twitter? There was a whole, long list of, spreadsheets full of requests about all these different journalists, and the scale of it was mind-boggling. And I think that, what unites all three of us, we were all three sort of caught up in this story of mass censorship that had, up until very recently, been hidden. And it's, I'm very grateful to you, because this is, this has to be out in the open more, and people need to know more about it.
I'm curious if you guys think we can fix this. Is there some, I think one of the things people are struggling with right now, especially with AI on the horizon, or it's here already, but that it's the robot, Skynet's turning on basically at any moment. I'm curious if you think we can fix this in an institutional way. Can mainstream media, whatever that means to you, can that actually come back? Can our broken institutions in government come back? Our educational institutions? We seem to be watching everything collapse at once. What do you think, Miranda?
I kind of think when you say come back, I'm now re-looking at everything that I believed growing up, and wonder if we ever had free speech, if the sort of old-fashioned traditional media, the New York Times, Washington Post, if they weren't got at in some other way, if they weren't producing propaganda anyway. I think what this moment that we have right now is a kind of an opportunity to look at the machine and how it's been working. And what Matt found, thanks to Elon Musk opening the files, was a rare glimpse into that censorship machine that's probably been with us forever. And one thing I will say about America, because you know from my accent that I spent a lot of my life in Australia, and you just look at the reaction Jay and I were talking about, different reaction to COVID between Australia and America, and what was different about America was it had a Bill of Rights, it had a First Amendment, and even though it's been strained to the max, it's kind of held, and it has protected America, and it has allowed us to sort of come through this. And I think for the future, that is the protection that the rest of the world doesn't have. And you saw Australia, Britain, Canada all succumb in a way that America didn't.
Jay, what do you think in terms of the medical establishment? Because you can feel it already. If you listen to the WEF, there's going to be disease X or the next COVID. My personal belief is that most people will fall for it again. They'll say, all right, this one's 3 times worse and you better do it again. And I think most people will. But what do you think about your colleagues in the institutions?
I mean, I think where we currently stand, it will absolutely happen again. If there's another pandemic, and there will be another pandemic, the same playbook will come out. Because we haven't repudiated it, right? That we haven't repudiated the lockdowns, we haven't repudiated the censorship. And on the one hand, I mean, there's some tremendous pessimism there. Like I'm not the same person I was in 2019. I can't look at that my profession with the same pride and optimism that I once did. But on the other hand, I mean, there is this tremendous promise. Like I keep thinking about the Gutenberg press, right? The Gutenberg press comes out, and it's a major threat because it democratizes the access to information to vast numbers of people that didn't previously have access to it. And the powers that be suppress. You know, Galileo is a victim of this democratization of power. You have a democratization of communication, and out of that process, ultimately, is the Enlightenment, right? The ability to communicate at mass turns into a major benefit for science, and huge progress comes out of it. I think that we are potentially at the first stage of that same kind of revolution now. We have access to information that was unimaginable just 10 years ago. We have access to computation, and the only question is, what do we use it for? We could have a second Enlightenment if we want it, or we can have a totalitarian power if we want it, and that's the.
Matt, what do you feel about that on the tech side? Because it's interesting that we have this Twitter files release. You find out that under the hood, and I went there myself, I mean, basically the entire system was designed to shadow ban. I mean, Jack Dorsey literally testified in Congress that there was no shadow banning, and then you look at it and it's like, that's what the whole thing really was. But we find that out about Twitter, but we still really know nothing about Google or YouTube. I mean, it's the same company. Or we're about to follow Mark Zuckerberg into the metaverse. I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but are you confident that we're going to be able to traverse this by just following the same people for the last 2 decades who have brought us to this point?
Yeah, definitely not. It's funny, the shadow banning thing. Twitter actually put out a post. I think it's something like the truth about shadow banning, and the first 2 lines are, do we shadow ban? We do not. One of the first things that we found in the Twitter files, like the first day that we were doing it, was actually Jay's personal page, and there's just a screenshot of his name, and underneath it says Trends Blacklist. And it was proof that that's what they do. And it turns out that there's this extraordinarily elaborate system where they can dial people all the way up to everybody sees you, and dial other people down all the way down to nobody sees you, even if you follow that person. So what you talked about with the analogy with the Gutenberg press, I think it's a fascinating one, because the internet, when it first arrived, it had promised to be this revolutionary democratizing tool because of the speed, the virality, the inability of governments to match the exchange of information. We saw with the Arab Spring, with Occupy, all these different movements that governments couldn't keep up with it. I think that's what happened, though, is that when they saw that, and especially when they saw Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, who went without the ascent of major media because he had a Twitter account that was very, very popular. They tried to turn, I mean, the story for me of the Twitter files is turning the internet into a tool of surveillance and social control instead of a democratizing tool. And if they decide to go all the way with that, that's when we will get that totalitarian outcome. And that is a very real possibility, and I think we all need to be very worried about it. And that's why, gatherings like this are so important.
I'm curious if you guys think that there's a political solution to this. I mean, as it stands right now, we're about to just redo the last election. We're going to have Trump and Biden, and regardless of where you may fall on that, it's just the same thing. And I don't think that's what most people want. I think we're being handed just something to keep the show going, basically. And I wonder, do you think, Miranda, there's a political solution to so many of the problems, or is this a people solution? Is it a technological solution?
Well, I think it's a problem when you have so much power concentrated in the hands of a few companies. And so, I mean, there was talk, and this was actually a threat that was held over the head of Twitter and Facebook that forced them to comply and commit this censorship. But breaking up these oligopolies, this Section 230 idea where, as publishers, they should be bound by the same laws that the New York Post is, libel laws and contempt laws and so on. I think that's a good idea. And, the fact that you have a company so powerful that it's able to deplatform an elected American president, as they did to Donald Trump, frightened even Emmanuel Macron in France.
Mm-hmm. So Sanders.
Well, exactly, yeah. So that's the only political solution I can see.
Jay, I'm curious because I actually don't know that much about your politics. I know your thoughts on COVID and some other things. Do you find it odd that I think more so now you're thought of as aligned on the right, let's say, just because of where things are at with COVID and free speech relative to this administration and everything else?
I look back on what I thought about politics in 20. I have to say, I never deeply cared about politics. I was curious. I read the papers and I had some ideas, but I thought no one cared about those ideas because my scientific ideas were really what were important to me. And politics came to me. I don't like it. I just don't. I find it deeply uncomfortable to because I think my political ideas are just jejune. They're not that interesting. The only political idea it turns out I actually have is small L liberalism. Like let's have free speech. That's my main political idea. The idea that that's a controversial thing, I still can't wrap my mind around. We're in court in this Missouri versus Biden case. This is going to get heard by the U.S. Supreme Court on March 18th. There's going to be oral arguments. And it's literally a case where what Matt said happened. That's exactly what we saw in the Missouri versus Biden case. You see emails from the federal government to Twitter, to Facebook, telling them who to censor and what to censor, threatening them, saying, if you don't censor, your company's dead. So the idea that an American government would actually ever think to do such a thing is just, I still can't believe it. And I think it's so deeply wrong that if the Supreme Court doesn't slap it down, I don't see that we have a First Amendment anymore. So that's my politics now. I'm in public health. I think it's a very different game than politics. It's supposed to, if public health doesn't convince 95% of the public that they're right, then they've failed. 50 plus 1 is not enough, right? In that sense, I guess I've failed, right? I've said things that 50% agree with and 50%, maybe now it's 95, I hope it's 95. But that's what public health is supposed to be. It's not 50 plus 1, it's supposed to be 95. It's supposed to be above politics. It's supposed to unite, not divide. And that's where I am.
Matt, what do you make of this political realignment that we seem to be happening? Because I mean, Jay's saying it. He's not very political. I tend to be a little more on the right now, whatever that means. But I was a lefty most of my life. You were definitely a guy of the left. I used to watch you on Real Time, thinking this guy's a lefty nutbag. And now we're pretty damn close. And it just doesn't matter what those differences are. But the point is that there is this mass realignment that has really very little to do with Democrat or Republican. Trump has changed all of this. But generally speaking, the people who are open to your message tend to be more on the right now, which must be a little bizarre for you.
It's totally bizarre. I mean, I grew up, kind of a traditional ACLU liberal type. I remember when the first day after the Twitter files, the first Twitter file story came out, the Washington Post described me as conservative journalist Matt Taibbi. But that's just where we are. We're in this bizarre realignment. When I grew up, I didn't know anybody who was, for censorship. There was nobody among the liberals who I knew, and basically everybody in journalism who I knew. I grew up in newsrooms my whole life because of my father. I didn't know any reporters who had any feelings in that direction whatsoever. And I think as recently as 10 years ago, you would have, if you polled journalists, probably 95% of them would have been in agreement on this issue. We saw this after, Glenn Greenwald broke the Snowden story. But in the last 10 years or so, there's been this dramatic realignment where suddenly free speech codes as a right-wing issue. And I think basically that's a strategy to try to delegitimize the issue and to try to scare a certain demographic into not paying attention to what this story is really all about. Because if you actually pay attention to what's in, for instance, the exhibits of Missouri v. Biden or the Twitter files, it's not a partisan story terribly. It's really much more about the exercise of government power and a decision to make sure that the government has the ability to place leverage wherever it wants to at a moment's notice. And that doesn't have anything to do with politics. That has to do with big versus small, government versus the ordinary people. And I think it's the concern of everybody, not just left or right.
So Miranda, to that point, the Hunter Biden laptop story comes out. It's banned on Twitter. You can't even direct message it, which are the private messages. You can't message the link, et cetera. What was it like in the newsroom there, and what kind of pressures were you guys under? I mean, somehow New York Post, which I'm from New York City, I used to buy every day for a quarter and ride the subway. Like, how did New York Post end up doing most of this right in a time when New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera, have all done it wrong?
Well, we had amazing editors, I have to say. Without, the courage, particularly of the top editor, then Col Allen, the story never would have seen the light of day. But in terms of the reaction, we knew that this was a bombshell political story because it was showing that Joe Biden had lied when he said he knew nothing about his son's overseas business dealings. But that was it. What it became was a much bigger story about government censorship and about the FBI, about the America's security apparatus, basically combining to censor an uncomfortable story. And so we were kind of gobsmacked. It cost the Post a lot of money. Twitter didn't just, it wasn't just the story was suppressed. Twitter actually locked the New York Post's account for 2 weeks. And, the way newspapers work now, we rely on social media to transmit our stories out. It's an important channel of communication. And so that was quite shocking. But it also tipped us into an understanding that this was a bigger story than just, the Biden grift. This was, as we got into it, and thanks to you and Missouri versus Biden, all of that, we saw a glimpse into the apparatus. And one example is that the reason that the FBI was able to pre-bunk our story, which they were doing, for every week they were meeting with the social media companies, and they told them a few weeks before our story came out to be on the lookout for a hack and leak operation from Russia, likely in October, likely about Hunter Biden. Now, why did they know? They knew because they had had the laptop for 10 months. They knew what was in it. They knew that it was damaging. They also had been spying on Rudy Giuliani, who had given us the hard drive. And they knew, therefore, or they should have known if they were doing their job, they would have had access to an email that came to Rudy Giuliani from the owner of the laptop repair shop, giving chapter and verse about what he'd found about Ukraine and China and so on. And then they also, if they were, which they were, doing their job, they would have seen a few messages between me and Rudy, or mostly me to Rudy, because Rudy doesn't really answer, just saying, look, hold off, don't give the story to anyone else, you know, we're interested. So they kind of knew everything, and that's why when they pre-bunked the story, they were doing really malevolent, malign work.
Wow. We only have about 5 minutes remaining. I thought, let me ask you guys the same question, and it's probably the one question that none of you want to answer, which actually is the personal part of this. It all comes with a cost. It comes with the cost of friends. It comes with the cost of finances. It comes with the cost of the government literally looking into your finances while you're there. What was the congressional, what was the name of the hearing that you were at?
Oh, the weaponization of government?
Weaponization of government while the government is showing up to your house to weaponize the government. There's a cost really at every level, whether it's being shadow banned or outright banned or everything else. How has that been for you guys? Jay, let me start with you first, because I sense you're probably the least person that wanted to get involved in this in some respect.
I mean, I spent the first 6 months of the pandemic in a state of anxiety. All my friends that I respected and loved essentially turned on me. My university, where I'd been a professor for 2 decades, and had been now almost 40 years as a student and as a professor, I had sweatshirts that I almost burned, and I was going to leave the university. I was so angry at the place, and it was just it was a state of shock. I mean, I looking at pictures of me from in that video that you guys saw, and I'm like bone thin because I lost 30 pounds of anxiety. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. But now, actually, I look around the room, and I've replaced my friends that I used to have with a much better set of friends. I gained some of the weight back, so I was going to write a pandemic book, How to Lose 30 Pounds in a Pandemic.
Miranda?
Look, I haven't really suffered at all. I mean, I sort of feel a bit of a fraud being up here because I'm a journalist, I mean, this is what we're supposed to do. And I guess it's just sad that so much of journalism has become propaganda. I write a column. I mean, I am actually biased. I'm paid to be biased. So, but I was a reporter, and I write a reported column. So, it's got to be fact-based. And the idea, as we've seen, I mean, the reason that this fantastic prize, RealClearPolitics, has come up with is because the Pulitzers and the sort of establishment, grand media brands have become so corrupt that the Pulitzers now, are awarded to the Washington Post and the New York Times for the Russia collusion hoax, which I don't know how many times it has to be proven that it wasn't true. But no one's handed back the Pulitzers. The Pulitzers hasn't asked to get them back. I just don't really understand why it's at all controversial that journalists should not be propaganda merchants and telling lies. Accuracy was the kind of holy grail for journalism, and the truth is accuracy. So, I've seen a lot of people in this story that have been damaged. Practically everybody that had anything to do with Hunter Biden has either dead, in jail, under indictment, whatever, or collapsed with lawfare or broke. So I think the Bidens are a kind of toxic stew, but so far so good, touch wood.
Yeah, just to mention a couple of things. You talked about the Washington Post and the New York Times winning for the Russia collusion hoax. They also, as we found out in the Twitter files, they were attending meetings in August of 2020 to prepare to not cover Miranda's story. We found that they were meeting at the Aspen Institute to have a tabletop exercise about how to not cover a hack and leak story involving Burisma and Hunter Biden. And they were journalists from the Times and the Washington Post. And so they win the awards for not doing journalism, I guess, now. That's how that works. But the only other thing I would say, I just want to agree with Miranda. I mean, journalism, we're not rocket scientists. The only thing we get paid to do is to, be willing to put up with a lot of criticism to be unpopular. I mean, if you're not willing to do that, then you really shouldn't be in this business. And I think we were both fortunate to be involved with, important stories. And this is part of, it comes with the territory, but it's very, very great to be recognized.
Well, on that note, I just want to say what a pleasure and honor it is to sit up here with you guys and be in a room really with so many of my friends and colleagues who are all just trying to fight this thing the best way that we can. And on that note, I want to bring David from RealClearPolitics back up, and please give it up for these guys right here. Thank you, guys.
David, I'm bringing your $25,000.
Oh, there you go. Wow. That is
the equivalent of,
that is.
Thank you all for coming. I think we know why we're here and what we have to do tomorrow, but there's about 30 minutes left on that bar. And the place is expensive, and I want us to actually get most out of it. But really, David, again, thank you for this.
Thank you.
Thank you. The goal of this was to kind of tease out the unum that connects everybody here. And it seems like the scientific method and the First Amendment are locked at the hip. They rise and fall together. And I want to thank you for really bringing that out. And I think that, it's so clear. I think Dr. J. Bhattacharya, it took me a while to learn how to say this. I think my wife has a crush on you. The good news is, it's like, I think we're on the side of angels. And we can win this because I think that everybody who used to be a liberal and now is a progressive can be reminded how to be liberal again. But I think they just need to be woken up to the truth that it's what connects us. It's our unum. And I thank you all. And I hope people are going back to the bar. Thank you.